and welcome everybody. I'm Abbie Grotke, Assistant Head of the Digital Content Management section in the Library of Congress, where I lead the Web Archiving Program team. I'm delighted that you've joined us tonight for Why Web Archiving, Preserving Internet Content for Research Use. This evening's event is kicking off the International Internet Preservation Consortium, otherwise known as the Iipc 2022 Web Archiving Conference. The events this week are all virtual and completely free and co-hosted this year by the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress recently celebrated its 20th year of web archiving. Since 2000, we've made available over 29,000 web archive items on the loc.gov website in 85 event and thematic collections. Web archiving collections at the Library of Congress contain digital materials from almost 200 countries in over 100 languages. While my team provides program and technical support, the collections are developed by subject experts all over the library in many of our divisions. Web archiving is just one aspect of the library's varied digital collections efforts. Before I hand things over to our moderator for our panel discussion, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. This event is being recorded and live streamed and will be available on YouTube for 24 hours after the event. An edited version will be made available at a later date on the LOC and IIPC channels. We encourage you to submit questions of the panelists and the moderator by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can ask the questions anonymously if you'd like. You may also upvote questions that look to be of interest to you. The chat is also open, and we encourage you to use it to engage with other participants and share information and say hello, like many of you are doing. We will not be monitoring the chat for questions, however. Again, please be sure to use the Q&A for those. Please be courteous in the Q&A and while using the chat. We will share a link to the IIPC Code of Conduct for your information. Lastly, if you would like to use closed captions, click the CC button in your menus bar. Now on to the show. I'd like to invite on camera and introduce my good web archiving friend and colleague, Ian Milligan, Associate Professor of History and Associate Vice President in Research Oversight and Analysis at the University of Waterloo. Ian is our moderator for this evening's event. Hey, Ian.
Hi, Abbie. Thanks so much.
All right, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Abbie, and so great to see so many familiar names in the audience. So I was asked just to put a few quick framing remarks together for this event. And I started by thinking, what will we call a historian studying something like the COVID pandemic in 10, 20, or 30 years? They're going to be using the web. How else will they learn about our news ecosystem, our social media feeds, the information and misinformation that shape the world? Will we call them a web historian, or will we just call them a historian? And that's because the web and its archives lie at the heart of the future of, well, almost, I think, any study that's looking back to the mid-1990s or later. That if we as a society want to do justice to understanding almost any dimension of our society, culture, politics since the mid-1990s, we're going to have to draw on, access, and use web-based primary sources. And that means we're going to have researchers that need to use all of this information, and we need to find a way to preserve all of that data. Now, that's why we have events like the International Internet Preservation Consortium, an international gathering of libraries, archives, and other memory organizations, as well as scholars, researchers, curators, activists, thought leaders, and beyond, to think about how we collectively can rise to the challenge of being able to tackle our memory in the future. It's interesting to reflect that web archiving itself has a surprisingly long history, which is sometimes really neat because we still think of the web as new media. In 1996, internet entrepreneur Brewster Kahle started the Internet Archive in a tiny house in the Presidio of San Francisco, the little house on the prairie stage of web archiving, beginning to save large quantities of the internet onto tape. And 2 years later, in October of 1998, the Library of Congress received, with triumph and fanfare, a donation of their own first web archive. It came with a statue. It was 2 terabytes and 63 inches, 500,000 archived pages. And that seemed big then, but now it's something that all of us could carry around in our pockets, which underscores just how complicated this world is. That web archiving, as we're going to learn from our colleagues in our discussion tonight and through the conference that follows this opening event, is complicated. that we take so much of the internet for granted, but just think about how much of an interplay it takes to display even one website. If you went to loc.gov, you'd see images, you'd see links, the ability to go to Instagram or Pinterest or Twitter or YouTube. You can zoom into documents and into the tiniest smudges on a page. But if I go to loc.gov tomorrow, it will be different than it was today. And it will be different than it was yesterday. So what does it mean to preserve loc.gov? Do we preserve it every day? Do we preserve it every month, every week, every second? What does it mean that I use my laptop to view the webpage when I made these remarks and checked it with my iPhone this morning? What if it's interactive? We might want to look at previous versions of the Library of Congress's page through a web archive, often through the Wayback Machine, named after Rocky and Bullwinkle's machine from that cartoon, which lets us see these older websites as they once were. Or we might want to think about viewing them differently, looking at them as text or all of the images or all of the pictures. That the possibilities are limitless, but also terrifying, as the amount of data we're talking about in these conversations scales to levels few could have imagined 2 decades ago. Hundreds of billions of archived web pages, hundreds of petabytes. And a petabyte is itself 1,000 terabytes, which is itself 1,000 gigabytes, which hurts my head when I think about it. So in 20 years, when we look back at COVID and other events that are sweeping our world today, this is the kind of landscape we're going to be leaving our researchers. So we will need librarians and archivists and memory professionals to help preserve and steward this material, and scholars to imagine what we can do with it all. So at this point, my goal in these short opening remarks was to just introduce problems, which I will then walk away from and leave all of these problems and thoughts with our panelists. And so what I'd like to do now is introduce our panel that'll be joining us today. So I'd ask them to come up onto the virtual stage so you can see their faces as I introduce them. And I'll introduce our 4 speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. So our first speaker tonight is JJ Harbster. JJ is head of the Science Reference Services in the Science, Technology, and Business Division at the Library of Congress. Her first introduction to web archiving was in 2005, nominating content for the Hurricane Katrina Collaborative Web Archive, and she has been involved with collecting and preserving websites ever since. Our second speaker is Beth Osborne, a librarian at the Law Library of Congress. In addition to providing reference, research, and instructional services in the area of US law, she has been involved in web archiving for the Law Library for the past 4 years. Prior to entering the field of librarianship, Beth was an attorney in the New York State court system. She is currently on a supervisory detail to the US Copyright Office's Outreach and Education section and returns to the Law Library this summer. Our third speaker is Ben Lee, a 4th-year Ph.D. candidate in the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington, the other UW, where he is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow in Machine Learning. He recently served as a 2020 Innovator in Residence at the Library of Congress and the 2020 to 2021 Richard and Ina Wilner Memorial Fellow in the Straum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. Previously, he was the inaugural Digital Humanities Associate Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and a visiting fellow in Harvard's History Department. And then last but not least, our final speaker tonight will be Dr. Emilia Acker, an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Information, where she leads the Critical Data Studies Lab. Her research on data archives and preservation has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Institute for Museum and Library Services. In 2016, Acker was awarded early access to the Obama White House Social Media Archive and has since then studied preservation and access issues related to social media data. Acker's current research focuses on cultures of mobile computing, emerging digital preservation models, data literacy, social media data archives, and metadata standards for exchange between private and public archives. Previously, Acker worked as a librarian, an archivist, and a mobile app developer. And when she's at home in Austin, you can find her biking, bouldering, or swimming about town. So thank you to all of our panelists. And with that, I will invite all of us to turn off our cameras, except for JJ, who will lead off our conversation tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and hello, everyone. I'm really enjoying seeing where everyone is from. This is truly an international conference, and so it brings me a lot of joy to see all of the geographic locations in the chat. So as Ian introduced myself, I am JJ Harpster. I am the head of the science reference section at the Library of Congress. And when I was posed the question, why web archiving? As a librarian and now a champion of librarians or a supervisor, but I like to consider myself a champion of librarians. I've spent many years, and those years were through trial and error, of how to integrate web archiving in traditional collection development activities. And so part of my job is to help the library develop the science collections. And so I like to ask myself questions like, this is a big one. Am I collecting and preserving scientific knowledge for Congress, for current users, and for future generations? That is a very big charge and a very big question. But I also ask questions like, is there something at risk of not being collected? And what can I do about it? So communication of science, as everyone knows, is expanded outside of this realm of print. You know, we ingest things that are born digital, you know, in blogs and social media and all those other things, YouTube. So there's so many factors that prompt me to archive something from the web. And oftentimes it's documenting a moment in time. So one of the good examples is Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Or maybe there is a theme of things that I'm collecting. I truly love polar bears. And so I have been selecting content that documents how these beautiful animals more than likely are going to become extinct, probably in my lifetime, which is very sad. So I'm collecting all sorts of material about polar bears. I also collect material, I also collect material that's afraid of getting lost. There's some sort of risk involved. And that led me to do the science blog archive. And let's see, I have little prompts to keep me on track because I have 5 minutes. So through the years, what I've now come to understand about web archiving is that sort of my style and purpose of archiving tends to go more towards the thematic or the event-based. And I see myself more as a curator than a librarian. And, you know, because like as a librarian and at the Library of Congress, I can't collect and preserve everything. I feel like that's a romantic notion and nobody can achieve that. I don't think that's achievable. But what I can achieve is a curated, represented collection. And so that's kind of where I have gone that direction. I've gone to that direction. So, you know, taking a snapshot of a moment in time or identifying represented content that tells a story, answers a question. Those are the sort of things that I'm trying to do when I'm archiving for the web. And I think am I at my 5 minutes, Ian?
I haven't been keeping very strict time.
Okay.
So feel free to wrap up your idea, JJ.
Yeah, I'll just quickly share a couple of the projects that I've worked on over the years. One of the projects, which is my baby, I consider it my baby and I treat it like a baby, is the Science Blog Web Archive Project. I started that almost 10 years ago. Next year will be 10 years. And so as I've been working on that project, I started understanding more about science communication, how information is distributed, how it's sort of organized and that sort of thing. But one thing that unexpectedly happened with that collection is that I noticed because it's been almost 10 years now, that I was documenting some early careers of science writers. that now have very big jobs in science writing. But I was collecting their blogs when they were just starting out. So that was a very unexpected thing that happened with that. I also led an Earth Day 2020 web archive project. That was Earth Day was turning 50. Little did I know that in 2009, when I was creating that project, that there was going to be a global pandemic, and we would be on lockdown in 2020. I still decided to continue with that project, with the Earth Day 2020. And again, something unexpected happened, that I started documenting the first digital Earth Day, which was not my intention from the start. The last project that I'm working on right now is the Coronavirus Web Archive. And with that archive, what I've been focusing on is not only is balancing the science and the business, industry, policy stuff with more human stories. And how I got to that was when I started thinking about historical pandemics, and I started being in science. I started reading up on historical pandemics, especially the influenza of 1918. And I was really noting things that authors were citing, topics that they were focusing on. There was a lot of talk about mask wearing and such. And so I thought it was really important when we were creating this web archive that we really needed to balance that science and policy and business with very human stories. And so the impact of everyday lives and what those people were doing. And so we did a lot on what do we call it? Corona cuisine or something, cooking and fashion and religion, performing arts, all of that kind of really human stuff that makes us human. So I will stop now and give the floor back to Ian. Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks for kicking us off, JJ. Beth, I'll turn it over to you for your remarks.
Hi, thanks, Ian. And like everybody else, I'm so happy to be here and talk about web archiving from my perspective. I am a librarian. I'm a law librarian, and my background as an attorney informs that. And I come to you today with the perspective of somebody who's also a curator like JJ. I have been doing this for about 4 years. And I did not start this archive. The archive has been in place since 2007, so a good amount of time before I assumed responsibility for the collection. And so that was just interesting in and of itself, since I kind of took over from something that had been started by other folks, at a different time period. But so we're talking today about what is the value of web archiving and what are its potential uses. Why do we archive legal blogs? That's my area of expertise. The law library decided to participate in web archiving, kind of like JJ said, to preserve at-risk born digital content. And so the archiving of legal blogs fits within that mission. Web archiving ensures that these collections will be accessible to future generations, or we hope they will, future generations of researchers. And we do this because blogs are temporary. They can go in and out of existence, at the drop of a dime. They're relevant to the legal profession. They can be very niche, so they can be very on a very specific topic. The third thing is they're being cited as for their legal analysis by courts. And when we talk about law, we talk about primary sources of law, which is a case law is an example of that. That's coming from the courts. And then we also talk about secondary sources. So a secondary source is something that informs those primary sources. So we would consider legal blogs to be a secondary source of law. The legal blogs enhance the law library's collection. The Law Library of Congress, their mission is to provide access to an unrivaled collection of U.S., foreign, comparative, and international law. And so we believe that the archiving of legal blogs is important to this mission. So, I mean, one of the things that I talk about a lot when I talk about the collection that I work on is that I love the fact that the blogs are kind of several types of information, right? It's an overlapping attributes of because of the medium and the content. So the legal blogs are a source of information, right? In this case, legal scholarship and analysis. Bloggers are pushing out, kind of newer ideas or discussing areas where the law is changing, emerging law, and they have the ability to publish quickly. And then there's also drawbacks to that, in terms of authoritativeness and long-term relevancy, the depth of their analysis and the agenda of the author. So all these things are kind of in comparison to more traditional forms of legal scholarship, like, law reviews or kind of more peer-reviewed publications. And then two, blogs are a form of social media, right? It's an avenue for discourse, and they typically invite engagement and critique in the form of comments or responses. So it's more interactive than your traditional secondary source, like a treatise or something that doesn't really invite responses. And of course, their websites, right? That's the third thing, which is interesting in and of itself, because the physical design and the layout they're important to the conveyance of the message. And fourth, they're a brand for some people. They're a form of advertising. They're a form of marketing. A lot of these blogs are written by law firms for the purposes of marketing their services. And but also the field is also heavily dominated by academics who have their own brand to sell in terms of relevance, prominence, and quality of research. So all four of those things sort of come together in a legal blog. And so that's where I'm interested. I don't know which of those things necessarily is going to be interesting to researchers in the future. Are they going to be interested in, the physical design of a legal blog? Are they going to be interested in the content? I hope they're interested in the content. That would be the, my biggest hope. But I think, because I had to be sort of comfortable with that ambiguity, I have made it my goal to try to make sure that I've cast a wide net, and that we cast a wide net and bring in to the collection blogs that are diverse, represent a variety of topics and voices, present a consistent level of intellectual debate, and that could be in danger of being lost to time or neglect. Along those lines, I also had to get comfortable with, a willingness to reassess items that maybe are in the collection and are no longer in scope or have become defunct. So I think one of the best parts about web archiving is I get to look at those things. I go through my reviews, and if I find that it can be, the crawling period is over, the website is defunct, the blog is no longer useful or no longer in the scope of the collection, I get to free up room and bring in new content and new voices and new blogs into the collection. So that's what I really love about it. And that's, what I get out of web archiving and why I think it's important.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Beth. And I'll go to our third panelist now, Ben Lee. Thank you again.
Thanks, Ian. And hi, everyone. It's very nice to see you all, and I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today. So I'll give a little bit of background on my own research, and then perhaps talk a little bit about what I see to be so exciting about web archives, especially from the perspective as somebody in computer science. So my research generally, what I'm interested in, and as Ian mentioned, I'm working on my PhD in computer science out at the University of Washington, is really how we do what I might call computing cultural heritage, how we really think about doing projects involving machine learning in order to improve access or facilitate search and discovery for cultural heritage collections. So thinking along the lines of libraries, archives, museums, memory institutions. And along these lines, I think what I'm interested in particular is really some of the questions at scale about how we search over massive collections. My dissertation is largely centered around a project called Newspaper Navigator, which I began with the Library of Congress through their Innovator in Residence program in 2019. And the goal of this project was really try to reimagine how we search over millions of newspaper pages, in particular from Chronicling America, which is maintained by the Library of Congress. And at the time, had about 16 million digitized historic newspaper pages. And so one of the real challenges that we wanted to ask was, first, how could we try to extract this visual content at scale? And then second, how can we reimagine searching over it? So we released a data set, and then also a search application that allows you to search not only sort of by keyword search or by facets, so looking by state or by data publication, but also to search by visual similarity using some underlying machine learning mechanisms. And so I say all this because I think despite the scale that emerges through Chronicling America and thinking through, around a terabyte of data from all of the digitized newspapers, as Ian had mentioned, when we start to sort of level up and think about web archives as we move toward, a single petabyte, let alone hundreds of petabytes, the questions become, I think, really fascinating from a number of different perspectives, especially computationally in terms of how we even make some of these search affordances possible, and then what we can do with machine learning. I do want to just mention a little bit in terms of, I think, to be one of the exciting things about web archives in terms of how it highlights so many different disciplines. Here I'd point to, I think, Ian's book, History in the Age of Abundance, and all of his work in terms of describing how web archives will, of course, change the contours of historical research in the future and even currently in the present. And I'd add all the work in the computational social sciences and the digital humanities, but also from computer science and STEM as well. For those of you who might be aware of some of these bigger machine learning projects that train what we might call foundational models around like GPT-3 or these really large machine learning models, pretty much all of them are trained off of web archives as well. And I think it presents a really interesting opportunity to try to really imagine how we search over these collections and understand their composition, because it really affects how we train these models and think about them from a computer science perspective as well. And so I mentioned that I think really the exciting sort of frontier of web archives for me personally is thinking about these kinds of search and discovery systems at scale, and how we can really think about how web archives are unique in this case, not just in terms of how big they are, but in terms of the ability to try to do interesting new mechanisms for searching over text and images jointly, how we can use web page layout as an interesting way of trying to surface recommendations or search in general. And so here I'd mentioned projects like Archives Unleashed, but also thinking through these kinds of general challenges and what machine learning might offer us. I'll mention that I've started some of this work with Trevor Owens here at the Library of Congress and thinking through how we can try to search over born digital government PDFs. So in particular, leveraging the Library of Congress's wonderful data sets and the 1000.gov PDF data set. And I know there was a question in the Q&A already about good places to get started. And I think some of the Library of Congress data sets for born digital collections are a great starting point. Just to think through some of the questions of how we actually try to search over these materials using mechanisms other than just keyword search. So this includes things like visual similarity, where we uncover all sorts of interesting PDF documents, containing maps or containing heavily redacted documents that might not be surfaced if we just sort of look at the metadata that were provided. I mean, I think I'll wrap up my section here by talking a little bit about who would the audiences be for these really kinds of massive search and discovery systems that I envision or have talked so much about here. And for me, I think there's one question, of course, which is the research perspective, and I had mentioned all the disciplines involved. I also think there's a really, really compelling curatorial component of this too for subject matter experts in terms of, if you inherit a born digital collection or a web archive to try to provide a finding aid or some descriptions for, where do we even begin if it's too big? And I think being able to use some of these new, novel computer science affordances to be able just to understand the broader contours or some patterns that are emerging, give at least a place to begin to bootstrap up. And then lastly, of course, I mentioned, I think for the general public, being able to think through new ways of searching and discovering materials sort of per the larger goal in, I think, cultural heritage these days of thinking about serendipitous search and also just generally new ways of searching. Web archives are certainly fit this mold very well. And I really hope that as the research develops here around search and discovery, it really brings new people to the collections as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ben. And then I'll turn to Amelia for our last speaker of the panel.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. And thanks for the organizers of this event, LSC and Iipc. I'm really excited to be here with the panelists for the Web Archiving Conference. So yeah, I'm an information scientist who researches and teaches about how digital preservation approaches are changing and how that impacts the way we understand society and how we know ourselves with these new tools as we create digital information more and more online. And so in my research, I'm really trying to examine the methodological and ethical challenges of collecting and analyzing and preserving data at scale, especially from our new information and communication technologies like social media platforms, mobile apps and the wireless networks that we use when we're connecting with our mobile phones and using all these new tools. And so as an information scientist who relies on data from the internet to do my research, I'm really concerned about the rise of increasingly privatized platforms of information infrastructures that we're now using to create personal records, corporate documents, even government communications. And what internet researchers and web historians like Ian and Ben know is that the information that we create today really does need to have really important, thoughtful people like yourselves thinking about how to save it, because the stuff that we create today in networks is really radically ephemeral. And it's really difficult for us to rely on platforms to preserve and provide access to this information over time. So for empirical and historical scholarship, we're really facing a replication and reproducibility crisis because we don't have access to things like social media data in particular. And that's why web archives are so important. So that's why we need really visionary archivists and web archiving efforts and institutional leaders like LOC and other organizations to preserve our digital culture that's now just not only born digital, but born networked in systems like the teleconferencing software that we're using right now. So I thought I'd use a few minutes on why web archiving. My section to tell you a little bit about a research study that I supervised with some master's students a few years ago in a class I teach on metadata, where we played around with the Library of Congress's web archive of memes from Meme Generator, which is this online site that allows users to create and publish memes to share across networks online. So at the iSchool at UT, I have the great privilege of teaching all kinds of information professionals, archivists, librarians, and data scientists to learn how to sort of play and leverage and learn about metadata with lots of different kinds of data sets. But we're always looking for historical and really internet-driven collections to play with. And LOC's web archive has a lot of different kinds of collections that we play around with. And in the course, I teach students to use OpenRefine, and some of you may have heard of this software before. It's a great open source toolkit that allows journalists, researchers, data practitioners to clean messy data sets, but it also has really powerful analysis tools and features that allow you to sort of parse text or identify languages and bundle it up or locate patterns in strings of text so you can group together different kinds of trends across structured data. So OpenRefine works really well for metadata or the titles from memes, the text that we find on top of the image macros. So it's really great for analyzing web archiving data and data sets that are derived from web crawls. So in the metadata course, we used LOC's archive of Meme Generator and these related public data sets that archivists had created. Information from crawling the whole site in 2012. So my students were very excited. It's very old vintage memes. If you like and follow memes. And so Meme Generator is sort of like a printing press for memes. It allows people to copy not just images, but also copy text. It lets you to update and change them in different ways, and vice versa. And so you can see the titles change over time. It gives us a really good insight into cultural expectations of humor, politics, current events, and so on. The public data set from the Meme Generator archive is about 57,000 unique memes, and it links to archive versions of those images. So you can bring it into OpenRefine and study these trends across not only groups of images, but different kinds of texts. So we were able to do time series of changes in phrases. We were able to detect 5 different languages across the data set and work with this huge corpus of what we call historic memes. So I'm happy to share more about that in the discussion, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience using web archives that already exist in my teaching and in research, training new librarians and archivists. We publish our results, and we'll share this too, of the analysis in an IEEE conference, Social Media and Society. And if you want to check it out, it's kind of fun. But I just want to remind researchers and reference folks today here at the conference to consider how often internet scholars, our students and our colleagues don't know about the web archives that already exist of new media or the internet now. And we really need to share and tell them, because internet researchers have a bias towards collecting their own data sets and creating silos. So we really need to publicize and share different kinds of scholarly and pedagogical approaches to using and reusing these collections, like the Web Cultures Web Archive at LOC, which contains like hundreds, probably thousands of really exciting archives that are not only born digital, but are born network records that we're creating together on the internet. And as Ian said at the top, that we've been preserving with web archives for decades now. So thanks, those are my comments.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Amelia. And I might just, as I invite the rest of the panel to turn the cameras on to come back in, ask the audience to give us that sort of cavalcade of applause for those 4 wonderful presentations. 4 presentations, I think, that have done such an excellent job of laying a foundation. And I'm really in awe of the amazing work that these scholars are doing, helping to build collections, helping to think about access, reflecting on the role in society today, and questions of sharing and education and discussion that lie at the heart of our community of web archiving practitioners, very broadly defined. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to kick our conversation off for a few minutes. And as I pose questions to the panelists that I know a few people already have, just again, a reminder, if you do want to add to the conversation, do click on that Q&A tab at the bottom, ask a question, and we'll shortly begin asking some of the audience questions. But just as people put their questions in and so we can all catch a breath, I want to pose a question to our 4 panelists here. And that is that we've all seen web archiving in the news, I think, quite a bit over the last few months. With the Ukraine crisis, certainly, with political debates in the United States, with which, as has come up today, the response to COVID-19, and in the United States and in the world, Canada had its moment in the sun a few months ago. And these are wild events, and just the legal blogs, lots of transitory things, lots of emotions, everything's moving really, really quickly. So I'm really curious if the panel could reflect on how you react to these big events happening in real time. So I definitely will turn to JJ and Beth for this first, and then I'm curious as well as maybe Ben's thoughts on access and Amelia's thoughts around the memes and the private platforms. But JJ, what's your thoughts on this?
I'm still trying to process the whole coronavirus thing. Working on that web archive, it feels like it's never going to end. And it's just it just keeps, there's like another phase or another something. And I feel like I am so lost, not lost, maybe not lost is not the right word. But I'm so focused on that, that I'm not seeing what else needs to be done. Like what's happening in the Ukraine. And I would imagine, the library is very international in scope. And so I would imagine some of our area study folks are preserving Ukraine web content, I would imagine. I'm not currently involved in that just because coronavirus is still around. I know there will be a sort of end, or it will there, I know it has to sort of wind down, but I feel like it really hasn't. It's been a very long 2 years for everyone, that is. We're collecting, we have about 85 active collections on a range of topics. Yeah. I will pass it off to Elizabeth. She might be doing something.
Yeah, I think, Ian, your question was, how do you react to it? I would say, I try not to overreact to the exclusion of, I hope I'm phrasing this right. I try not to kind of solely focus on that. When these events come up, what I try to make sure is that my collections have topics and cover things that are covering those topics and ideas. And And if I can see a gap because something arises in current events, then I kind of redouble my efforts to, so, maybe the collection was slim on health law blogs. So during the pandemic, we tried to refocus and make sure that we were getting like the newer voices, different voices in that perspective. So I try not to, my collections are very pragmatic because they deal with the law, and I try to make sure that I'm just getting enough voices in there, and when these things happen, it's a time to look at the collection and see if there's gaps. So a very librarianship approach to it.
And we've done a lot of analysis, like Elizabeth was alluding to, like with the coronavirus web archive. So we were looking at the various subjects, seeing how many, do we have gaps in, say, what religion's response was, or a specific religion's response. And so there was a lot of analysis going on as we were developing as well as collecting content. And things change, directions change, scopes change, purposes change. And I think it's good just to kind of be aware and flexible, and not be so anchored to a certain purpose, and sort of allow that flexibility.
One thing that I've found like really exciting is that we're beginning to see that web archiving is becoming something of a citizen science project. We could probably go back and mark it to one of the last presidential transition, I think, with data rescue projects. Edgy was, our colleagues in Toronto made a big efforts towards rescuing online data, but we're seeing that with Sucho, someone's mentioned that in the chat, with Saving Ukrainian Heritage, and then with many of the early COVID tracking dashboards, the COVID tracking project and many others started with volunteerism efforts, people really wanting to save our online cultural heritage and share it for different kinds of things. So from a cultural perspective, it's super exciting that increasingly these tools are being accessible and easy, and you just need concerned citizens or a group of people who really want to save stuff. And really rapidly, we can see informal to more formal web archiving projects just happen really quickly, which I think is really, really exciting. And maybe one of the bright things that came out of, lockdown pandemic and suddenly switching to Zoom Life and Slack and these new tools.
And I guess what I might add, coming from the perspective of a researcher, is that I think it really underscores the distinction between digitized materials and born digital materials. That's the specific immediacy of it all. And I think it's really compelling. I mean, being able to get up and running with a data set, people might say under the language of collections of data or something like that, in such a short turnaround, I think is really compelling. Digitization, I think, it has its own certain cadence or limitations in terms of how long it takes practically to go from a physical material to something that you can use in a digital realm. And so for me as a researcher, I think, one, it's super exciting. And so echoing what everybody else has said here. But second, I think it also, once again, necessitates all sorts of really interesting and compelling tools that allow you to get up and running really quickly. And I think that's also a great opportunity to rethink this also on the computer science end too.
Wonderful. Thanks to the panel for such a thoughtful discussion on, one day COVID will end. I had to knock on wood when I think JJ was saying that, but it's certainly, a lot of going on and really fascinating responses. So turning to some audience questions, Christopher Werner asked a question, directed primarily at JJ, but I think others on the panel might think of this, might have thoughts on this as well. And the question from Christopher is, if you can't collect everything, how does one justify or bound what topics or events are worthy of being collected? How can we at this moment predict what will not be useful in the future? So JJ, maybe I'll throw to you for your first answer, but I think certainly then the other panelists could think on this too.
Yeah, I always say I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what future researchers, historians, scholars, and the like will need. 50 years from today. But what I do know is what current, historians call, what they're using and what they're looking for. And it changes. There's definitely things ebb and flows. One thing that really helped us, I think it's a good opportunity that to bring this up, is with the coronavirus web archive, is one of our web archivists created a rubric for us, because there was so much information and we had a lot of things to go through, a lot of topics, because it's international. The whole entire planet was affected by this. Every single living being was affected. And so we created a rubric. And so whenever we looked at content, we would ask questions like, does this have research value? We also asked, can this be easily crawled? Is this something that we can actually capture? So we had, I think we had about 17 different questions we would ask ourselves. Also, developing a scope and a purpose, I think, is super, super vital to any collection. But I think you also need to reflect and revisit your scope and purpose as you're going on. So if it's a long-term project, like the coronavirus is in year 2 on this, we are reflecting and now doing analysis. We're looking at where we have gap areas, but we're also asking questions like, now we're pivoted towards, vaccines and going back to whatever the endemic phase, stuff like that. And I'll share the stage with my colleagues.
Yeah, Amelia, Beth, or Ben, any thoughts to add to that?
JJ, you nailed it. That's a very comprehensive response. I mean, there was a couple of questions in the chat about scope and and sticking to it. I mean, it's a dance, right, between adhering to your scope and also trying to think outside your scope, which is something that I think the people who are involved with any collections work struggle with. But it's not a perfect science, and I think, and I think the most important thing is don't work in a bubble. I have colleagues and a lot of other people who are involved in my project. I may be kind of calling it my collection, but it's not my collection. There's a lot of other people who are involved in looking at things, approving, discussing, and we try to kind of work collaboratively on that.
I'd say, approaching this as a researcher, one of the most compelling things about web archives for me is oftentimes seeing the desiderata or the strategies adopted in terms of what's collected. I think it's incredibly useful. Once again, maybe bringing this back to other collections, oftentimes one of the challenges with newspapers is, not even that, of course we have to accept that there are all sorts of newspapers that are out there that we'll never have copies of, or they're incomplete. But part of the challenge is not just even with having that understanding, but not knowing why certain materials were decided upon to be kept, hundreds of, 100 years ago, what the process was like and what the genealogy is. And so I think it's really exciting to be at a time where we actually can trace that genealogy a bit more clearly. And it, I think, really makes it much more straightforward to use web archives, at least from that perspective. And I think also will allow us, maybe 50 years down the road, as JJ said, even though it presents all sorts of challenges about who knows what people will be interested in, at least we'll have an understanding of what the process was like.
Perfect. And I see that, I think Zainab asked in the chat as well, the bias and selection criteria, and then you discussed that really well there. So we have a question. I see some upvotes on it, so it's obviously a pressing question for the community, which is from Carolyn Franger. She says it's a basic question. It's not a basic question. Can anybody contribute to web archiving? How do you get started with contributing to web archiving as a whole? So maybe because Amelia works with students in this area, maybe Amelia, what are your thoughts to that question?
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to think that there are two kinds of sort of swim lanes of web archiving. There's macro efforts that we see from huge organizations that's formal collecting, lots of resources, and then micro efforts that will be individuals, small groups, people doing it, not-for-profit work. Both kinds of swim lanes, or both types of web archiving efforts are just as important. So there's lots of different ways that you can have one click and be involved. Save Page Now is a great plugin that I use with my students when we're looking for things. That's a way to contribute to the Internet Archive, sort of tacitly as you're encountering things. You can also sort of send efforts or lobby, our librarians and archivists at Library of Congress and so on to say, please collect this or give us advice. But I feel like there's there's a whole continuum of ways to get involved. At a professional level, we train web archivists or web archiving at the master's level, usually at least in US iSchools. But there are many workshops and programs that you can learn about and find out about, are publicized through different professional associations like this one as well. I don't know, maybe other colleagues have ideas.
I'll pause a beat to see if JJ, Beth, or Ben, although I think Amelia, you've laid it out really well.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's I mean, besides my professional capacity, I'm also just an interested citizen. And when I see things on the web that I think should be captured, I try to capture them on the Internet Archive or use those, the features that you talked about kind of. So absolutely. I mean, I think it's great to have it coming from both sides. Yeah.
And I often share things I discover that might not be under my purview, and I'll send it to somebody else going, gosh, I found this really great thing. I think we need to preserve it. So I participate in that as well. And I agree everything that Amelia was saying.
Yeah.
I might add too that from the perspective of getting engaged with web archives in terms of using them, I think it's oftentimes surprising how many people engage with web archives, but might not be familiar with the term or the language behind it. I mean, so many people use the Wayback Machine or encounter it in their sort of daily media consumption. And so in a sense, we're already all using web archives. It's just about the right framing or language for it sometimes too, which is, I think, compelling.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, and some good resources in the chat too. So the next question we got from the audience is from Melanie Solomon, which I think this is a great question. Is anyone actively preserving quote unquote bad info and misinformation driven web content sites? I suspect we could all speak to that. Maybe Beth, I don't know if, I'm sure no law blog has ever published misinformation, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're passively doing it in that collection, probably. I mean, the thing about content that's coming from a blog or an individual is that it's not always well vetted. I mean, that's kind of the interesting part of the legal blog, the archive, and things like that, social media archives like that, is that well, what are we saving and how will this be useful? There are some big questions. And, what is the impact of saving going to have on its reputation over time? These are things I think about from a scholarly perspective, and concerns I have. But are we also just are there efforts to, deliberately preserve that? I do think that some of the, citizen archiving projects that are going to Internet Archive and other organizations are doing that. It's just that that's not really something that the Library of Congress has set, that I'm aware of, has set out to do in an assertive way. We may be capturing content that later proves to be inaccurate or misinformation, but there are no, I don't believe that there's a, JJ, is there any concerted efforts to do that?
How we approached it for the coronavirus web archive, because there was a lot of misinformation or disinformation, both was prevalent. And we really didn't want to nominate content to give that misinformation authority, because if they get an email from the Library of Congress saying, we're going to preserve your website, we did not want that to say that we agree with the information they're distributing. So what we did is that we approached a big sort of misinformation aggregator. I think it was called NewsGuard. I could be wrong on that. But it's a database of just all sorts of misinformation and where you find it. So rather than going to individual sites that are providing this misinformation, we decided to go into use an aggregator. And I think that was a really good solution to that problem.
I can speak to a little bit about what some disinformation and misinformation researchers have been doing in collaboration with platforms. It's a real ethical issue because if you save it and preserve it, in some ways, it is an archive of all the skullduggery that people can reproduce, right? And so some of the stuff we actually do want removed from the internet, but perhaps we do want to have researchers or students to have access in some way. So how to provide access is really hard. Twitter for a number of years has been publishing data sets of state-backed operations, misinformation operations, and they publish the accounts and some of the reasoning and metadata behind how this is a malicious botnet. Some disinformation researchers have begun to establish things like data co-ops because the platforms remove access from misinformation once it's been published after a certain amount of time. And there are a few co-ops beginning to start. Of course, we are still hemmed in by the terms of service with which we access the data. So usually the platform APIs don't allow you to share data once it's been deleted or taken down. So it's an area that's a really big concern, especially for scholars of political communication, malicious content, and disinformation. And it's something that we really need to think about, how to provide access to some of those secret, sensitive content that we maybe do want to provide access to, but in limited sort of ways or in gatekeeping ways.
I see the value in researching that stuff. It's just that we just didn't want to give this authority, saying that, we think their content is good it was, we were collecting it for other reasons, I guess.
Perfect. Yeah, I know in my own work, I've seen that in the 90s. Right when people put a stamp on their website, say, hey, this is being archived by somebody. That means my website matters. So we have a question here from Harbster Andresen, who writes, as an archival science professor, I find it interesting that the term curation is emphasized. Well, appraisal might signal both expectations of accountability and transparency, and also a more open approach to successive recurations. And then he's got the question, is there a risk of web archiving being too tightly connected to the views and perspectives of the collectors? A risk that, of course, is also relevant to more traditional appraisal work. So because I see JJ smiling, I see Beth nodding, maybe I'll throw to one of you for your thoughts on this question. Maybe JJ, because you're smiling the most.
It made me smile because just as librarians, we're always biased. And, depending on what environment you are, you're trying to reach certain goals and stuff, but I'm always going to have a bias towards a certain type of information or a certain topic, or like the polar bears. I'm really sad about that. And it affects me. And so I am making sure to collect all sorts of information about polar bears. So that, I think it's something that's always going to be there. I don't think we should hide it. We should sort of embrace it. But I think also you need I think Elizabeth mentioned this, not to work in a bubble. And I think you need to be communicating with your colleagues and sharing and sort of getting fresh new eyes and different perspectives, and being open and receptive to maybe going to some sort of other type of information that you were thinking, no, I don't want to collect that. But but it's important too. But yeah, it's always there, bias.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the components of the question was, kind of focused on the word curation as opposed to appraisal. I mean, I think we're doing both. I mean, where it's because we are limited in resources. Just the fact of evaluating for scope is part of the appraisal process. I mean, no one else is inside my own brain, but I mean, I'm doing the best that I can, I would say, when it comes to that. But the way that I do that is by inviting other voices, trying to have a well-written, clear public scope and reasoning behind the collection, and making sure that other people in the library are always aware of what we're doing. So that's the best. I try to do the best I can,
Perfect. And I think that's the right approach. And so I see we have another question here. It's about scope creep. I think we've talked about scope creep enough. If we have time, I might come back to that. But I think we've at least partially answered that for our anonymous attendee. And so I see Marlania Christensen has an interesting question here, which is, how do you facilitate searching the web archives? That she's struggling getting people to use web archives because, of course, it's difficult to search for specific topics. Ben, maybe I'll look to you as someone who's been, working on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, I think web archives in terms of searching are really interesting because in a sense, we're already so familiar with how we search the web, from something like Google, and we have some sort of fluency in what we might expect from what we try to search a system. On the other hand, though, looking back on web archives, though, there's so many possibilities for new ways of searching that I think oftentimes might be a little bit restricted in terms of we all have this sort of shared vision of entering text into a box and seeing what happens. I think there's a lot of exciting, computer science research, information science research in library science as well, going back decades in terms of reimagining how we do that. I mean, I generally say that, I fully anticipate as we move forward here, these kinds of search systems will become more expressive, allowing us to do things beyond just basic keyword search. I think, really compelling examples could include, searching by image. And obviously, I think Amelia and others have spoken about how, we can trace virality or things like that through and look at network analysis and things of that nature. And I think that all falls under the domain or purview of search as well. And I'd say too, we can think of specific use cases in government collections, trying to retrieve different document types by, congressional seals appearing or things like that can be really valuable too. I actually think, maybe to tie this back to the previous collection too, one of the, maybe the perspectives that I might take on how we access web archives is not just even the bias of how we, how they're collected, or how we curate them, and the question that emerged, the one that was just addressed, but also for that person sitting in front of a computer trying to search a web archive, there are all sorts of other mediating layers that occur here throughout the search tool and everything as well, that imprint on what they're able to find. And I think looking at that sort of closed loop is really fascinating. And I think trying to reimagine what it's like to sit there as the end user using one of these systems and compiling lists of, what are the specific kinds of affordances that are useful to people? How do they want to be able to search? What are these kinds of questions that they have? Remain really interesting questions. And, one that I'm personally very invested in as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And Amelia, you were name checked there. So I just want to see if you had any thoughts on the, searching with your students and these difficult collections you're using.
Yeah, Ben raises this really good point that we see everything through the Google search bar. And before the ascendancy of the keyword, there were all these other ways of finding information in objects, even web pages. So my favorite thing to do is to try and give students or friends, my brother, for example, a challenge, a quest, to try and find a bit of information, a fact from one of the oldest websites that they can find on the Wayback Machine, for example, or even going to your library's catalog and messing around with the electronic resources options and just seeing what the web was like even 5, 10, 15 years ago really gets people into a different way of thinking about what is potentially possible. And I don't know. That's one thing that I try to get people to think about, is just actually looking for information, not through known knowns, known keywords, but trying to answer it with stuff. And just remembering that the web is full of all this different kinds of stuff, and web archives have those, like amazing resources like Internet Wayback Machine. I want to say the Web Cultures Collection at LOC has these sort of like vignettes, like baseball cards. And that was really helpful for starting inspiring. So that helps me when I'm trying to get people excited about, I don't know, researching and using web archives as evidence in their, I don't know, scholarship, learning, and so on.
Perfect. Thank you, Amelia. So we're nearing the end of our-
Metadata. Sorry, metadata. Really, really good metadata.
Yes, the metadata is one of those critical words. So we're sort of nearing the end, so I'm going to go to a lightning round question. So I'll see what people think, but really quickly, because it's a big one from Karen Liston, which is, how do you avoid duplicating your efforts? So maybe, Beth and JJ, I'll just see, how do you handle when we're all doing, to make sure we don't all collect the same website a million times? Beth.
We're duplicating our efforts. I think in some respects. Yeah, I mean, there's that's like saying like there's 2 collections in the Library of Congress that hold congressional materials. Well, there is. I mean, there's that there is some overlap, and putting them together in a collection, hopefully is meaningful to that. And so it's possible we are duplicating some efforts, but, when we co-locate those things with like other things, in kind of that original library sciencey type way, then, hopefully, even if it's a duplicated effort, then it makes sense to the researcher.
And yeah, there's definitely duplication going on. One thing that I did during the coronavirus web archiving project, which is still going on, was to attend meetings to read what other people were doing in this respect in terms of web archiving. So I couldn't understand everything that was going across this planet, but I was definitely trying to be aware of what was going on in the US, what was going on in other countries in terms of web archiving, and seeing where we could fit in. But yeah, there will be duplication.
And I see in the chat, Amelia put lots of copies keep stuff safe, and it dovetails with a giant question. Unfortunately, I don't think we're gonna have time to get to tonight about the succession planning of the Internet Archive, etc. So, there's value to this work. But I want to ask the one last question here really quickly before we wrap up tonight's event. And this came from Dorcas Johnson, who's a grad student at Kent State, majoring in digital humanities and archival studies. And their question is, having taken an introductory DH course, acquiring many new skills, where do I look for internships to advance those skills in practice, more beyond theory in an initial DH project potentially, with many thanks. So this is a big question. I think it's a good way to end tonight's conversation. What do we do when we all want to get into this big field? So who wants to tackle that first? Ben, do you want to tackle it? And then we'll see.
Sure, definitely. No, I mean, I definitely appreciate the question too, because I think I'm certainly a relative newcomer to the space compared to everybody else on this panel, and certainly many of the attendees as well. I mean, I think one of the best first steps is just immersing yourself in the community. And I think the conference over the next few days is a really fantastic way of doing that. I know practically, I think Abbie dropped in some resources in the chat about LC internships and things like that as well, which I think I personally advocate, to make a plug for being as close to the collections as you possibly can to do your research. And I think it's a great opportunity as well. And yeah, I'd say, finding these kinds of active communities where you can participate in the research and also share ideas. I think even per the deduplication effort, maybe in terms of a very liberal interpretation of that, in terms of research, there's nothing like meeting other people and seeing what they are working on and learning from them as well.
Amelia or JJ or Beth, any quick parting thoughts on how do we get where we all want our next generation of practitioners to be?
Well, I was going to say you should check out all the cool web archiving projects and tools. Ian is a great member of our community. The Archives Unleashed project is a good place to start. Conifer used to be called Web Recorder, also I think funded by Mellon, big into preserving digital art online. The Programming Historian is really cool. Just maybe some of the library and software carpentry resources, but just getting your feet wet into learning about the different tools, approaches, different ways that researchers and librarians have partnered with, institutions, philanthropies, and so on is a great place to start. That's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I think the same thing, and like going out there and talking with people and going to conferences like this, and or just watching YouTube videos and get inspired. Yeah, I think just going out there and talking with other folks about what's going on is a great way to kind of set a path that you want to go down.
Oh yeah, and LC Labs. That's where I heard about the meme archive. Yeah, so follow that, put that on your RSS reader, or like tip into their blog. They talk a lot about all the different stuff that you can do, new collections coming out. It's a great place to see how other people are using these collections as well.
And let us know when you do, because we're always interested in talking to the researchers that are starting to use our data sets. So please be in touch if you attempt to use any of the stuff we've put out there for you. So with that, I think we need to close the event. Thank you so much to Ian, Amelia, Beth, JJ, Ben. This has been really fabulous. So exciting. Thank you to all the attendees for the fabulous questions. Look for the recording available on loc.gov and Iipc in the future, and please do share it. I also wanted to thank you to the Iipc colleagues, Olga, Kelsey, and Robin, for your tremendous support tonight. Robin is on UK time, so we're really grateful that she is here with us tonight, late for her, but we're really happy that you all joined us, and this was a fabulous conversation. So thank you very much, and hope you have a good evening.